Hi, I'm Brett King, the author of Bank 4.0, The Rise of Technosocialism and Augmented Life in the Smart Lane. I run the world's #1 banking and fintech podcast and the world's #1 fintech podcast. I advise the Obama administration and President Xi on the future, and I love talking about where the future is going to take us. I'm very happy to be here on Voices of the Future.
What a privilege to have Brett King in our home and in our beautiful little studio, which is really a made-up studio just for today, just for Brett. And a deep privilege and honor to have him here with us on Voices of the Future. Brett, as he introduced himself, he is a world-known figure in the finance world. He is the de facto person whenever somebody thinks of banking, fintech, banking 4.0. And I'm going to be pushing him into 5.0 and see where he takes us there.
We can do that.
And today we will have a meandering conversation, not just in fintech, but also about the economy, about the world, and how he sees the future in the Voices of the Future podcast. Brett, really happy to have you here. Thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure, Tony.
And it's an absolute privilege. And, you know, I have met you recently, but I feel there's a lot of connection, similarity of values.
We've got a big Venn diagram
The Venn diagram
right?
is overlapping considerably. We have the same hairstyle.
Yes. And the same barber, apparently.
Indeed. So there's a lot in common, and I have been a fan, a stalker, a learner from you for many years. So I'm very grateful for all of those contributions, because you were amongst the people who inspired me at a very early stage in terms of the way you saw things and a different perspective when you wrote your 4.0 book. And
the first principles thinking and
first
stuff like
principles
that.
thinking, absolutely. And that really made me stop and think and then start moving forward from there. And it has really shaped a lot of my work since then. So firstly, gratitude to you. Thank you very much for that. Brett, it really is a privilege for you to be here with us. But can we take you to a little Brett, 10 years ago, you know, when you were about 10 years old or 8 years old?
Sure.
What do you remember a moment which inspired you? What has shaped you today? A person who guided you? Because you have achieved so much. There must have been an ignition at some point in time.
Well, you know, I'm a kid that grew up in Melbourne, Australia, in the suburbs of Melbourne. You know, my dad was he was in construction, and then he ran a travel agency. He came from a very poor family background,
right?
And so I think, you know, he is. I think he's very happy with the progress I've made with my career, and so he's my biggest fan. But there were two moments that really were very critical in shaping my future at a young age. And the first was my awareness of the whole phenomenon of computing. So at age 13, I was working, I'd worked part-time doing a paper route, and then I was working at a butcher's, washing up meat trays to earn some pocket money after school. And you know, when I was younger, like 10, 11, you know, I was into BMX riding, and I had this bike. But at the ripe old age of 13, I sold my BMX bike to buy my first computer, which was a Commodore VIC-20, which incidentally was the first computer Elon Musk also owned. Because I saw that as the future, and I wanted to learn this medium. And I taught myself to code back in those days by buying magazines from the drugstore, or we call them newsagents in Australia, and you type in the code of a game so you could play the game in the machine. And you know, these were very primitive computing devices in today's term. And about the same time, I was living out in the eastern suburbs at a school that was essentially a feeder school for vocational training to go into the trades. So carpentry, you know, electrical, concreting and so forth. And I had no interest in that. I was interested in technology. I was all into sci-fi and so forth at that young age. And learned about a select entry program for Melbourne High School, which was in you know, obviously the primary city in our area, Melbourne City. And it was a select entry program where every year 15 to 1800 students would sit an entrance exam. And if you were smart enough, you'd be taken in to this program. And I was fortunate enough to qualify and get into that. And that changed the trajectory of my life, because this school has produced many thought leaders and leaders of industry and so forth. And for me, that opened my eyes to the possibilities that were there for me. I wasn't constrained by my upbringing and where I lived. I, suddenly had this vision of what could become. So they were probably the two most formative elements in terms of, young Brett, in terms of where I am today, if I look back honestly.
Yeah. So did your parents want you to be a doctor, lawyer, accountant, engineer, banker, as my parents did? And I'm a failed accountant, yeah. So I obviously went down the wrong track, and then I had recovered and found my niche in other areas.
Well, I don't remember my parents wanting me to have a particular career, but then I grew up in a rather unusual home environment, in that I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness in a very strict, religious household, and that was the primary driver for, it was that was the framing of your life. Everything had to be done, religion first, and everything else was second. I'm not involved in that anymore, so my parents were obviously very proud of the career choices and so forth I made, but in their view, your career was a temporary thing, because you were really dealing with your eternal soul, sort of thing. So they had a bigger picture. But my dad was very entrepreneurial. He grew up, he's a baby boomer, obviously, was born just after the Second World War, and grew up in what I would call abject poverty today. He taught himself a technical skill. He went to, it's essentially telecommunications, sure. Technology, and then, went into management, and it was a very good, sales guy, and so forth, developed those skills. But I think that energy for business and entrepreneurism I definitely got from him.
And our parents' generation was a very strong generation. They came
Yes.
out of the Second World War,
Yes.
and so on. And they actually, their work ethic and their resilience was just something that I always look at my parents for, and particularly my dad, to seek that inspiration. Fast forward into your business life. I mean, you've meandered through the world of finance, entrepreneurship, and so on. Can you just give us a quick recap of those years of your life, and how, again, as we start getting into today, how it managed to shape you?
Well, I started as a coder, as a programmer back in the day. And it's interesting, fairly early in my career, I guess this is probably about 88, 89, something like that, I went through an aptitude test, as many employers will put you through. And that's when I first realized that I had, I guess you would call it a gift, which is I tested, essentially 1 in 50 million in terms of my logic reasoning capability. It was sort of off the charts. And I was programming in the support team of this essentially financial services, software platform. And when they saw the results of that, they immediately promoted me as manager, in the support business and so forth. And that took me down a very specific path, which was simply the ability to communicate highly technical concepts to business people, to the layman, and also take business ideas and translate them into code or into technology architecture. And that skill has been something that I've amplified and worked on throughout my career, that communication skill between the technologist and the strategist and the business people in that respect. So I started in the coding space, obviously got into larger and larger scale projects. By the mid to late 90s, I was managing very large scale SAP implementations, and I ran my own ISP, internet service business, on the side. And so then when the e-commerce boom happened in sort of 98, 99, well, you ran an ISP, you must know about e-business. So I was at Deloitte at that point, and Deloitte sent me to Hong Kong to head up the e-business practice for Asia. Then I ended up heading up a digital ad agency, a company called Modem Media at the time. That's how you can tell they were one of the early digital agencies, because they were Modem Media. And, you know, it was a 4-office setup, about 160 people around Asia that I managed out of Hong Kong.
Right.
And then I started doing executive training. I was teaching at the MBA program for the Australian Graduate School of Management in Hong Kong part-time. And met a group of very switched on, you know, professional development guys, and we developed a continuing professional development business. I spun off into a digital strategy consultancy at the time, a company called User Strategy I created, working with HSBC, Citibank, you know, a lot of financial services, a bit of, you know, Cathay and some other organizations like that, but mostly financial services at that stage. Came to Dubai. In 2005, ran that financial services training business as well as the digital transformation sort of strategy consultancy. And then when the financial crisis hit, you know, all of that business sort of collapsed because training and consulting are the first to go when there's budget pressures. So I took a year off and wrote my first book, Bank 2.0. And it turns out that was a pretty good idea, because that set me on this trajectory as a banking futurist. But I had been as a frustrated science fiction writer, you know, since being very young. And so when I write, I'm writing short-term sci-fi in my mind, you know, that means that I've sort of had this role as a futurist, but within that, I've been you know, focused on, you know, macroeconomic trends, banking, you know, commerce, and those things from a skill set perspective, and obviously have worked a lot with, you know, all of the largest banking brands, you know, globally. And started the world's first challenger bank in New York back in 2010. So.
Yes, I'm going to get to that. And that was the spin-off from traditional banking to new banking or fintech. What was behind that? And I know you've been very successful since.
It's very interesting, actually, because when I did the book launch for Bank 2, which was in 2010, so we launched it at the Asian Banking Summit in April of 2010. I finished writing it on Christmas Day in 2009. And then we went to, in June, we went to London, and July to New York, and then August I was on the West Coast states doing the book launch. So it was a progressive book launch, primarily because the publisher wasn't even sure it was going to fly, you know, because it was pretty radical thinking at the time. And I remember so many times presenting these ideas of digital dominance, you know, how digital was going to overtake banking back in those early days, 2010. So many bankers would say, yes, this is all fine to talk about, but this stuff is really hard to do. And I'd already been doing, you know, 10 years in the trenches at HSBC and so forth, doing digital strategy. And so I fundamentally disagreed with that. I thought it was a matter of intent rather than, you know, technical complexity in many cases. Most of what we had to, you know, most of the barriers were apathy or traditional thinking that prevented that progress. And I remember being at this book signing at a breakfast run by Ken Rutowski, a media guy out of LA, in Santa Monica. And there was a venture capital guy there, William Quigley, and he said, this makes all complete sense to me. You're going to have a bank account you download to your phone, and you're going to tap your phone to pay and all that. He said, but banks aren't going to do this. So who's going to do it? And I said, I will. And so that afternoon, I went and registered the domain Move and Bank, and it became Moven, which was the first downloadable bank account. Now, what that means is we were the first mobile banking app in the world where you could apply for a debit card in the app without a signature, and you know, you'd get shipped the plastic card to you. And the first to use contactless payments as a technology, the first that rethought the design of a mobile banking app where the homepage real estate was used for financial health artifact instead of just your list of accounts, you know, real-time, you know, receipt experience and so forth. So, and that's become really a design pattern for the industry these days.
I mean, that was really, really sort of extreme future at that point in time. I remember
In fact, we were too early, to be honest. We were too, that's part of the reason. Movin is still around as a banking as a service platform. But the reason it's not the largest digital bank in the world today is we were just too early. We were about 4 years too early.
Yeah, I have made that mistake twice in my life, and I know exactly.
The futurist problem.
The futurist problem. For us, it's absolutely bloody obvious.
Glaringly clear.
Exactly. Like, why aren't people getting this?
People take some time to catch up.
I launched a mobile donation platform in 2004,
right?
And because I wanted to change the world and help humanity and so on, and people say, well, why would anybody SMS the good old days SMS $2 or $1?
Primary vehicle.
Indeed, and I said, in a simple billing system, everybody's got it. The telco will collect the money and get it out to the people. And then 4 or 5 years later, then the tsunami happened in Indonesia, and guess what? Everybody was 60% of the money came through on mobile, and then the rest, as they say, is history. And the second mistake that I made was in 2016 when I launched my podcast platform, which is probably about 2 or 3 years too early. And I struggled, and people, why would people? Everybody's going to short form and Instagram in 2 minutes, and you're talking long form, and you're talking audio. This is just completely.
Well, I mean, Breaking Banks, which is our podcast that's been running for 10 years, we started it in 2013.
Okay.
Right. So and it's still going, and it's still the #1 podcast in banking and fintech.
Okay.
But let me ask you, why do you think we called it Breaking Banks?
Because you were doing just that.
We were, but also the #1 TV show at the time was Breaking Bad. So.
I see. Well, there you go. So you're obviously smarter than I was, because mine was called Mad Talks. Mad as in making a difference. And we wanted to make a difference in the world, and we were talking about entrepreneurs, people like yourself, and talking about coming in and making a difference. But fast forward to today, as I was reading some of your work, I remember very distinctly that a lot of new strategy that the banks need to be thinking about needs to be experiential, behavioral, and human, as opposed to just technology-driven. Because technology is there as the underlying piece. And going back to first principle, do you want to share your thoughts on the genesis of that idea and how it came through?
So my research for Bank 4.0, which is the book you mentioned, which has the first principles thinking, I was fascinated by Elon Musk's approach to building Tesla and SpaceX and so forth, and looked more at the thinking behind first principles. And it became very clear that if you look at the major game-changing innovations that have hit the world, most of them are first principles thinking. The iPhone is a good example of that. The iPhone didn't take the Nokia banana phone or the Motorola Flip or the BlackBerry RIM keyboard and iterate on that.
Correct.
It was net new thinking. How do we get a supercomputer in your pocket that also can make phone calls? In looking at that, the epiphany was that. And of course, Gates is famous for this saying, but it was borrowed from CEO of Deutsche Bank back in '94, I think, which is, banking is necessary, but banks are not. And when you look at the trajectory we've been on, really since the 1950s with the emergence of mainframe computing, as technologies become more and more involved in banking, the ultimate form of banking utility is real time when you need it. And the technology's been catching up to that through that process. And if you were to start from scratch today, using first principles approach with the technology we have, and build a bank today, you'd build something that's embedded in your life through the technology layer. What you wouldn't do is you wouldn't ask someone to go to a building, sign a piece of paper with a signature, a first century artifact that has no security to it, and issue them a plastic card that was developed in the 1960s, right? That doesn't make any sense. So if you started from scratch, what would a bank look like today? It'd be a set of value stores or a money management tool embedded in your technology on your smart glasses, your smartphone, your smart speaker that you could talk to in your home or in your car, and you would have accessibility to that core utility of banking. And I call it the core three. the ability to safely store money, the ability to safely move money, and the ability to access credit when you need it. And what banks have done over the last 500 years is take that core functionality and wrap these products that have been designed for the branch. So, a savings account or a current account or a passbook and a checkbook as a value store. For payments, cards, telegraphic transfers, wires and so forth. For credit cards, mortgages, car loans and so forth. But they were designed to distribute through branch architecture. So when you start from scratch, what you realize, you still need that core utility. That's the core value a bank provides. But experientially today, we can deliver you that utility in real time immediately without all of the friction of the old banking system. And so if you look at the fastest growing forms of banking today, they're things like mobile wallets, like Alipay, WeChat Pay, Paytm in India, M-Pesa in Kenya and so forth, that are really making that real-time utility for payments and value stores and credit access just built into your life with minimal friction. And that's where we see that, real separation right now. So that's the first principles evidence we see for banking shifting.
When I'm advising boards and banks, one of the key things I talk about, apart from this, is stop hiring bankers.
Yes, yes, of course.
Start hiring anthropologists and data scientists and
psychological behaviorists, AI specialists, community advocates, identity brokers, smart contract engineers, etc.
Indeed. And also up to 70 to 80% of jobs that will exist in 2030, according to Accenture and Dell, in the financial world do not exist today.
Correct.
What are those jobs going to look like in your world?
Well, this really takes us to Bank 5.0 to some extent. And we're starting on that trajectory right now. So Bank 1.0 is traditional banking, okay? That's, the community-centered banking. We can really look back to the days of Medici, in Florence as the foundation of that. And that really didn't change up until sort of the mid-20th century, when with the emergence of, with Bank of America building IRMA, the electronic recording machine for accounting, which was the first mainframe computer. And then you had the self-service era emerge, so ATM banking, call centers, and internet banking in the 90s. And that's Bank 2.0, the self-service era. But Bank 2 was an extension of the branch model on these new technology channels. Bankers would often call this multi-channel banking, but that's really a misnomer. It was multi-channel branch banking because the process and policy thinking hadn't changed. Bank 3.0 was the emergence of the smartphone. App-based banking. And for the first time, we started to see some changes in terms of the way we thought about design. For example, for the first time, you could get real-time bank balance, which you couldn't do in the previous tech. Bank 4 is the embedded banking world. So where the utility of the bank is just embedded in the world around you. You talk to your AI. It tells you whether you can afford to go out for dinner with your friends or helps coach you in terms of money. And when you go to buy, when you walk into a grocery store, your smart glasses or your smartphone will tell you, it looks like you don't have enough cash for your groceries today. Let's help you solve that problem. Instead of having to go to the bank and get a credit card, as we used to. The Bank 5 era is AI-based banking or algorithmic banking. Because once you start looking at the way AI is developing, you realize that 80 to 90% of what we call a bank today will be able to be implemented in code at some point in the future. So if you take JP Chase with 160,000 staff around the world today, what does JP Chase look like in the 2040s? It's maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people managing this massive infrastructure of algorithms and autonomous banking. And then in the 2050s, you extrapolate that to a smart economy. So our marketplaces, exchanges, our trading mechanisms, supply chain, that's managed by artificial intelligence, distributed autonomous organizations, smart contracts and so forth. Because the most profitable economies in the world will be highly autonomous. And so banks that fit into that have to fit that, they have to be part of that platform. So you don't go to a bank in that future.
Sure.
The bank is part of the infrastructure of the world. So that's really the trajectory we've been on since computers started to emerge.
We're talking to Brett King on Voices of the Future, and we have covered his early part of his life. And as we launch into the future, into the real juicy, sexy stuff now, and we'll be talking and really, really shaking the tree. Brett, technosocialism, how does that work?
Actually, where I sort of got the ideation of this is twofold. I wrote a book in 2015. It's the one that ended up on President Xi's bookshelf, Augmented: Life in the Smart Lane. Yeah. And Augmented was designed to show people what their life of 2025 and 2030 would be like, with technologies like personal artificial intelligence, gene therapy, renewable technologies, 3D printing, all of these sorts of things. How, autonomous driving, how that would change the way the world would function. And it was more of a personal view in terms of how you'll live in this world with all this technology. But I realized the unanswered question, or the gap that was there, was, but how will society functionally change? Because, as more and more technology gets infused into society, that's going to create issues. For example, medical science, longevity, food production, all of these sorts of things. So what are the organizing principles that emerge? And I'm a big fan of David Brin, the science fiction author, and he wrote this piece, harking back actually to Will and Ariel Durant, their book Lessons from History, which talked about the fact that if you look historically at history, there was two overarching types of governance architecture. One was this pyramid style of governance, and so that's 99% of human history has been this pyramid style, where the 1%, the wealthy elite, control the power and wealth flows uphill. But those economies that have very poor wealth distribution result in inequality and so forth. But the most successful economy in history, the post-Second World War US economy, was a diamond-shaped economy.
Right.
So this is where you had a very robust middle class. The income curve was a bell curve. Income distribution was a bell curve, and that created all of these booms. The housing boom, the tronics boom, consumption boom, and so forth. And that at that time in the 1960s and early 1970s, the US represented 40% of global capital output because of that wealth that was generated by that really robust model. But the diamond-shaped models are inherently unstable because you've always got the wealthy elite trying to flatten the curve out again and get the wealth back uphill. So that happened in the 1980s, late 70s and early 80s, with Thatcher and Reagan attacking trade unions and collective bargaining and those sorts of things again. And then we have the sort of freeze of wage growth from the 1980s, real wage growth, and now we're reaping the effects of that. When you amplify artificial intelligence and climate change and the pandemic of COVID and those things on this model, you get real potential for chaos. So we wanted to map out what are the alternative futures or the possible futures that would emerge because of these things that are coming in, we've never had to face before, the complexities, and how would that change the way we think about socioeconomic, political organization structures. And we came up with a grid pattern, a four, quadrant grid, which was on two axes. One which was whether the future was chaotic or planned, and whether from an economic perspective you have inclusive models of governance or exclusionary models of government. So, in Europe or China, for example, they tend to be more inclusive. We would call it in classic terms more socialistic, democratic socialism and so forth. Whereas the US is much more focused on capitalism, the wealth of, the power of the individual. Even their constitution is more focused on the rights of the individual than the collective rights. So you have that collective versus individual view. And then in terms of planned versus chaotic futures, do we just wait and let things happen, or do we really plan to build the society more efficiently? Dubai is an example of a planned society, right? The US tends to be somewhat planning, but is more chaotic. But then you've got governments that are sort of completely chaotic. So you end up with 4 quadrants. On the chaotic side, you have chaotic inclusive, which is what I would call the ladder stand scenario, where we ban technological development, particularly AI, because it's affecting employment. Or you have in the chaotic individualistic world, you have what we call the fail to stand scenario, which is we just waited too long. Too much emphasis was put on individual rights and not collective rights. So when AI and climate change start to impact, you have systemic failure. Those are the more unlikely scenarios, but they will happen in certain jurisdictions. The more likely ones, the 2 competitive ones in terms of philosophical doctrine, are what we see developing in the US right now, which we call neo-feudalism. And so neo-feudalism or techno-feudalism is where essentially the richest segments of society own the best tech. They get access to early longevity treatments, all of these sorts of things. And when techno-unemployment starts to hit, they're like, well, you got to just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. There's no responsibility for the wealthy to pay for the poor who are impacted by these changes, because if they really wanted to do something about it, they could. And that ultimately is a problem in the case of broad techno-unemployment and climate change. But the optimal form of humanity for transitioning through these periods is what we call techno-socialism, which is where we use the technology advances we're making in medical science, artificial intelligence, and so forth to lift everyone up and improve the quality of life more generally. Better access to healthcare, better access to education. We use those tools to make government much smaller and much more efficient than it is today. But that requires us to dismantle many of the constructs around capitalism and things like that we have today, which are inefficient from a wealth distribution and broader, quality of life perspective.
Yeah, indeed. I'll challenge you on and
Please
interrogate a couple of points here. All of the institutions that we have at the moment, where and we'll talk about trust and trust deficit. They were built just after the Second World War,
Yes.
and the institutions, IMF, World Bank, United Nations, World Health Organizations, UNHCR, all of them were built for a different problem at a different stage in life to address different issues. They can't address today's problems, whatever the issues are. And when you talk about some of the key components that you're talking about. So that's the big question to me is, how do we dismantle or change these institutions, because they're big set of aircraft carriers. They're not going to move very fast. What do we need to do to fulfill any of your ideas in terms of techno-socialism, with these institutions being there as the big immune system response of holding things back? And that is probably going to be our biggest challenge, is that the institutions are not ready to fulfill our requirements, and therefore, I mean, it was embarrassing when we saw the Senate hearings on some of the technology issues. It really was. It was embarrassing. It was beyond that. These are our legislators, and they don't have a clue.
No.
I go into boards. As per Accenture, 10 to 15% of the people only are technically qualified. So 85-90% of the people do not understand technology, and they are making decisions.
Which is crazy, because if you look at pretty much every industry moving forward, technology competency is the single most important capability for being able to evolve your organization.
Yeah, and so recently I was advising a company where the immune system of the company, the culture of the company, basically I was there for a while, for 18 months or so, and it finally clicked in, and I started becoming irrelevant and a pain in the ass, because I was asking for change, and they would say, Tariq is a great speaker, this, that, and the other. But when it actually came down to changing something,
Yeah.
adjusting something, boom, you're having a...
Well, you know,
so how do you break that?
The way I put it in Augmented is that if you look at the last 300 years of technological development,
Yeah.
And disruption at an industry level, the number of industries that have survived unscathed with their business model intact over those 300 years is zero.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So therefore, you know, the resistance to technological change is ultimately, you know, pointless or futile, or as Commander Data would say, futile. You know, because you know, technology doesn't care about your sensitivities in that respect. In terms of the broader macroeconomic changes and the government changes, you know, Ray Dalio has the premise that, you know, you need wars, you know, to have this sort of leapfrog in changes. You know, I've spoken to many of my sci-fi friends, you know, authors like David Brin, Kevin J. Anderson, Kim Stanley Robinson, and so forth. And the consensus appears to be we've got about a 50-50 chance here as a human species to get this right. On one end, if we attach ourselves to the current model of capitalism and markets and so forth, then most likely humanity will go extinct. And Yuval Noah Harari shares this view and so forth. We have to have a philosophical shift for humanity.
Sure.
And I argued it in the book as it's an Aristotelian view of philosophy, which is Aristotle said that the purpose of humanity is to thrive, to grow and to thrive. But the only way we can successfully do that is together. You know, working together. So my argument in technosocialism is that if you look at the greatest advances that we've made scientifically, you know, the Human Genome Project, the Apollo project, putting men on the moon, even if you look at the massive effort around mechanization and so forth during the Second World War, those advances we've had technologically come from large groups of humans committed to forward progress and working together. So consensus building and cooperation are far more effective than competition. And we've built this market thinking around competition is the vehicle for innovation. But actually, if you look historically, innovation happens much quicker through cooperation than it does competition.
That's interesting.
And the problem with AI and climate change is that competition has created climate change, right? Competition for resources, the way we think about fossil fuels and so forth. And that thinking just cannot get us to the next philosophical stage for human growth.
Yeah. We've got hypercapitalism, so the 0.01% right at the top. They've figured out stuff. They figured out AI, they figured out data, they figured out how to monetize that, and there are not more than about 50 or 100 companies in the world that actually get it.
Yes.
There'll be 400 or 500 behind them that might be good. The rest are just literally worker bees and just feeding the system. So since they've already got the lead and they've got the secret of how data can be utilized, how that can become the new energy, the new economy, they'll just extend their lead. And all of the new innovations that are happening within AI are all these same companies who are investing back. Right. So my question...
And they're capturing this wealth and
So the dystopian view is that these 100 companies will effectively own the world and control the world for the foreseeable future. What can change it?
Well, you know, my partner, Katie Schultz, also known as Miss Metaverse, is a big fan of the cyberpunk genre, you know, and in that cyberpunk genre, and, you know, if you also look at future worlds like Elysium, you know, the sci-fi movie and so forth, or even, you know, Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy and so forth, the transnational techno corporations have sort of taken over the world. Ian Bremmer talks about this as a political commentator, actually. The fact that now you've got these massive technology organizations that define policy and move markets and have more power than governments in many cases. And when we see, you know, the Prime Minister of the UK or the President of the United States holding forums with organizations about setting AI regulation, who's setting the regulation? It's the tech giants, right? So, you know, we do have an interesting scenario right now where this immense wealth capture is going to be centered around these core technologies. And the biggest problem is now wealth distribution. How do you get that wealth distribution out to the market? Because you know, let's face it, even in the United States, only about 15% of the population invest in the stock market. You know, so even if you're invested in that, the wealth distribution is still going to be a massive problem, particularly because the way we've always distributed wealth since the Industrial Revolution is we give you a job and we pay you a salary. But AI, you know, is designed to eliminate human labor from the workforce. That's one of its primary jobs and roles.
Indeed, and I actually heard an advisor to some sovereign wealth funds here saying that some economists were talking about the fact that the only way to keep people happy, and these are trillion-dollar sovereign wealth funds, the only way to keep people happy is for them to have a job and to have work. That mindset to me just sounded very, very archaic.
Well, you know, I mean, that's not what you hear from the entrepreneurs.
No.
So when you listen to Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Richard Branson, Bill Gates, they all talk about UBI as the solution.
Yes, that's right.
So then if you think, well, why do we need UBI? Well, the reality is, if we look at all the technology booms in the past, the argument capitalists would make, you know, internet, for example, for every job the internet destroyed, it created 2 new jobs.
Correct.
Right? But we've never had a technology that can disrupt every industry simultaneously, which AI can. So large-scale technology-based unemployment is the expectation of pretty much every entrepreneur. So UBI is a relief valve, or a safety net for people affected by technology unemployment, where we can give you, that's how we'll distribute this immense wealth that AI creates. We'll give you UBI, and you can keep consuming, so we can keep the engine of capitalism going a little bit longer.
Yeah, I mean, the UBI could really be for every robot that you have. Could be almost like a robot tax.
Yeah, exactly.
So we could potentially
Gates
do that.
proposes. Exactly.
Yeah. You spoke about techno-socialism and techno-feudalism. I would like to go one stage further and talk about techno-colonialism.
Okay.
Because you've got, at the moment, governments go and take new countries. Tomorrow, Apple can buy Malta. Yes. Amazon can take over Cyprus, the nice, beautiful islands on the edges of Europe, and so on and so forth, because they are bigger than the countries themselves.
And that then gives them a voice on the world stage in terms of setting, you know, macro policy and so forth. So that, I mean, there's a lot of sci-fi authors that have predicted that. The recent Apple TV series, Extrapolations, played with that theme. Kim Stanley Robinson played with that in his Ministry for the Future and so forth as well.
Let's talk about things that are a wee bit more human and relatable on a day-to-day basis, and that is that both you and I, as futurists, and we tinker with technology all the time. So anything that can be digitized will be, because it'll be 1,000,000 times faster and 1,000,000 times cheaper. But anything and everything that cannot be digitized, love, harmony, compassion, heart, soul, spirit, judgment, critical thinking, intuition, imagination, creativity, and I can go on.
Psychedelics.
Psychedelics. I obviously can take one of those. But where I'm going with this is that those are going to be 1,000,000 times more valuable.
Yes.
How can we start capturing the value of these emotions and these skills and the truly natural things that we as human differentiate ourselves with? And the technology can be there to serve us. They can be the worker bees. But
that's the great thing about this shift, right? Because, you know, and this is the way I describe it. If I ask you what you do today, right? What do you do, Tarek? Your explanation in you know, 99% of the time is what you do to put food on the table.
True.
Right? But in the mid-2030s, 2040s, when I ask you that question, when you have UBI as a broad infrastructure, no longer is your job having to put food on the table. That's looked after by the wealth that's generated by highly autonomous societies. So you don't have to worry about that anymore. So then what work do you choose to do? You choose to do something you're passionate about that can change the world, or something you enjoy to do. And that's the difference that's going to happen in terms of the role of work in society. Work won't be something you have to do to survive. Work will be something you feel you can make a real contribution to. Jack Ma talks about it very differently. He says that from an education perspective, We need to encourage not just the EQ, but the LQ, the love quotient,
Yes.
right? Which is what the really connective tissue of human society.
Because that's the highest level of vibration.
Right.
Yeah.
So if now you have UBI, or you don't have to work as much as we do today to survive, then you may have periods of time where you are pursuing the arts, or you're pursuing learning, or you're pursuing social things. So in technosocialism, we looked at 70 UBI programs around the world, and we tracked their success. And what we found is that people in UBI programs started their own businesses at 3 times the rate of the general population. People under UBI programs were 70% more involved in community activities than the general population. So if you want to know, like, people argue about UBI, people are going to be sitting on the couch in the metaverse, they're going to be lazy. And that's just, I don't believe is the case, because people want to work. They just don't want to have to work to survive.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so that's the difference, I think, that philosophically humanity's relationship with work will have. That means then that where the margin is, you know, all of the stuff that can be automated, the dangerous, demeaning, you know, dirty sort of jobs that we have today, they're all taken by AI.
Yeah.
And what's left is stuff that's of real human value and experiential, and where we can, you know, get together as humans, which will be the natural sort of counterpoint to the high levels of automation that happens in society.
As a futurist, when I'm presenting my keynotes, one of my very first slides is talking about what's the most important thing in the future. And to everybody's surprise, the first word I put there is trust, underpinned by truth and ethics, and transparency. So basically this trifecta of trust, truth, and ethics, in my view, is going to define so much of our future. Technologies and things like that will just serve us. And then empathy and values to make it more human and livable. What are your thoughts on that? Is that how we should be looking at the world in terms of achieving a society with trust and truth, and ethical environments and moral environments, so that our drones are moral and they don't kill people, and our AI is not biased, and we put quality stuff in there so that we don't get garbage coming out?
If you look at the trajectory of information asymmetry, and all of these things that we describe, you know, I mean, it's often been said that today, you know, a farmer in Kenya that has a smartphone has access to more information than Bill Clinton when he became president of the United States, right, as an example. So if you look at that on a trajectory, right now what we see is efforts to manipulate information, to you know, to create certain biases and so forth, political movements, you know, the populist movement and so forth. But ultimately, and there's a very interesting sort of conspiracy around this, that the CIA developed this technology, remote viewing technology, in the 1970s called Project Looking Glass, and that every future scenario they played out, where, you know, sort of that information control collapsed because of AI and accessibility to information, producing sort of radical transparency. And I think that something like that is probably going to happen, because the more automation and the more information availability we have, the ability to manipulate that and hide that and so forth becomes more and more difficult, and you've got so many more moving parts. So I think we're reaching a time of radical transparency. Yeah.
Are you optimistic about the future? When you talk to parents, for example, you're a parent of a young child. Yeah. What do you tell parents with young kids and teenagers and so on, in terms of how they should shape their world and learning, shaping their lives, shaping their passions? What are your challenges?
One of the most common things I get asked is, what university program or what education should I give my children to prepare them? And my general answer to that is, instill in your children a lifelong love of learning. because they will have to adapt constantly throughout their career. So they're not going to have a career for life. That really doesn't exist for now. You and I have changed our career multiple times. So adaptability becomes very important. But I think the second piece of this is in the 2030s, particularly because of climate change, that there is going to be a broad policy shift with our millennial and Gen Z children coming into positions of government and power, redefining policy, where corporations and the market must first and foremost do good. That if you're a corporation that's highly profitable, but you're doing questionable things, you won't survive. And we start to see smart organizations like Apple, and Google talking about carbon neutrality and sustainability and all of these things, because they realize that brand shift is coming, is that corporations won't survive if they're just profit-making machines. So then if you think about the world of the future, I say to my children, what can you do? What movement can you join as a social mission to make the world a better place? Because the resources that will go into that in the 2030s in particular will be immense, particularly in terms of climate adaptation and climate mitigation, in terms of mass migration problems, food scarcity and things like that, retooling the world for new energy systems. The priorities of the market will be very, very different from where it is today, and people will really be able to embrace things that make a real difference to humanity.
What are you most passionate about these days?
So the first thing I want people to be aware of is that coming through this next process of chaos, this period of chaos, is that the world will be a better place, but we have to choose that outcome. If we fight to retain the existing value systems we have, then it's going to be harder and harder, more systemic collapse and more problems. So we have to not be married to the past. We have to embrace the future. And I think that's my job as a futurist. But I do also think that I am passionate about humanity expanding, our intellect, expanding our horizons, populating, and the solar system and beyond, and living longer lives so we can, reach deeper fulfillment.
What are you most scared about? What is your biggest fear? What is your biggest concern in the world today?
My biggest concern is right now that there is huge amounts of money and huge amounts of effort being spent to divide us with very arbitrary things like political thinking, monetary systems and so forth that have been essentially manufactured to distract us from these macro changes that are happening in the world. So that's probably what I find is the biggest challenge.
So as we look into the future, we come to your 100th birthday. We have come to celebrate your 100th birthday. What are we celebrating?
That's a really interesting question. I would like to say that I'm on Mars.
Nice.
And I'm looking at I'm looking at quantum consciousness and the effect of that large-scale consciousness as a species in terms of how we form our own reality, sort of next-order thinking of where we take the human species from here. But for me personally, I just hope that when I get to my 100th birthday that my children are happy, that I've made a dent in the world, and that when people look back at the contribution I made, that they think it's valuable, and that ultimately I'm considered a person that's been a net positive for society.
It's a beautiful sentiment and a beautiful statement. There's very little one can say after that, because when we talk about our 100th birthdays, I've done this hundreds of times, and nobody talks about money.
Yes.
Nobody talks about power.
Yes.
Nobody talks about all the bullshit that we have spent our entire lives chasing.
Yes.
And we go back to our humanity, our love, our family, people that belong to us, and so on. And
I just want to move the needle. I just want to make a difference.
That's right, and make a difference, which is actually my platform, my charity platform is MAD. We need to be mad. You're mad, I'm mad. And my professor, he described me as being eccentric, and I dare say you are to some extent too. And he defined it as eccentric being off center.
Yes,
we are off center,
for sure,
and we are the outliers.
Yes,
and the outliers are the ones who are going to bring about change, and everybody else is going to be
that's that Steve Jobs quote, right? The dreamers, the crazy ones.
And so on. And this is Professor Bazan saying, be a maverick, be mad, be crazy, but go out there, make a difference in the world and change the world. Brett, you are doing that so beautifully now. Thank you very much. It's been a real honor.
Thanks, Tarek. That's good.
Thank you.
It's great.